There is a specific kind of pain that has no name. It is not failure. It is not depression. It is not giving up. It is the feeling of watching everyone around you arrive somewhere and standing there with your hands full of things you cannot yet explain, wondering if the problem is you. If you know that feeling, stay with me. Because psychology has been studying a certain type of man for decades. A man who does not fit the standard timeline, who moves slower, struggles longer, and cannot seem to force himself into shapes that fit other people easily. And what researchers keep finding about this man, about what he eventually becomes, is not what most people expect. This is not a video about motivation. It is about something quieter and more accurate than that. Here is where it starts. Most of what the world tells men about success is built around a single assumption: that the earlier you arrive, the better you built it. That a man who is thriving at 25 is ahead of a man still searching at 35. And on the surface, that makes sense. We can see the man who arrived early. His life has a shape. It is visible and legible and easy to measure. But psychology has been quietly building a different case for a long time. Carl Jung spent decades studying how men actually develop. Not how society expects them to, but how the psyche moves when it is left to its own timing. And what he found was this: the first half of a man's life is almost always spent building for the outside world. Career, status, identity, the things that can be measured and compared. But around midlife, somewhere between 35 and 50, something shifts. The external structure that felt like progress starts to feel like a costume. And the man underneath begins asking a question he could not have asked earlier. Is this actually? Jung called this individuation. The process of becoming who you actually are. Not who you were told to be. Not who the timeline expected. But the thing underneath all of it. And he believed this process could not be rushed. It had a pace that belonged entirely to the person going through it. Now here is the part that changes how you read a man who seems stuck. Some men cannot commit to a life that does not fit them. And this is not laziness. It is not fear. It is something far more specific. Their internal compass is too sensitive to lock onto something false. You have seen this man. He takes a job everyone says is perfect for him and quietly leaves it after 2 years for reasons he cannot fully explain. He starts things and stops them. He moves from path to path without landing anywhere that feels solid. And from the outside, this looks like a man who cannot get it together. But here's what is actually happening psychologically. He is refusing to build on a foundation he does not believe in. And that refusal, that inability to fully commit to something that feels wrong, is not a flaw in his wiring. It is precision. It is a mind that knows the difference between movement and direction, even when it cannot yet name where the right direction is. This is hell in your 20s. There is no version of it that is not painful and confusing and lonely in a specific way that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not lived it. But it is a very different story by 45. There is a finding in psychology that most people never hear about because it does not fit the story we prefer to tell. Men who experience more early failure, more wandering, more dead ends, more years that look like nothing from the outside, tend to develop something that faster-moving men often do not. Researchers call it pattern recognition beneath the surface. The ability to read what is actually happening in a situation, not just what it looks like. To sense the thing underneath the thing. This develops from years of sitting with failure closely enough to understand it, not performing optimism around it, not escaping it, actually staying in the room with it long enough to learn its mechanics. While other men were learning how to win, the late bloomer was learning what winning is actually made of, what holds and what does not, what looks solid and what collapses under real weight. That knowledge is invisible at 30. It becomes decisive at 50. If this kind of psychology resonates with you, the kind that actually explains why certain men are built the way they are, consider subscribing. There is a lot more on this channel that I think you will want to see. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps. There is something that happens to men in the middle of this process that almost everyone around them misreads. They go quiet. Not because they gave up. Not because they are defeated. But because what is happening inside them has no language yet. They are building something they cannot show anyone, and trying to explain an unfinished thing to people who need it to already look like something. That is exhausting in a way that eventually just produces silence. So the man goes quiet. He does what needs doing. He shows up where he is needed without making it a conversation. And the people around him read this as stagnation. But there is a word for what is actually happening. Psychologists who study long-term resilience call it invisible construction, the internal work that produces no visible output but is entirely responsible for what eventually emerges. The slow building of judgment, consistency, and self in the years when nothing looks like it is happening. It is the most important work a man can do, and it almost never gets credit while it is happening. Now, I want to say something that the motivational version of this conversation always skips. Not every man who goes through this delay comes out the other side intact. Some men carry the years that looked like nothing as evidence against themselves. They arrive at 40, 50, 60, and instead of reading those years as the foundation they were building on, they read them as proof that something was always wrong with them. They become bitter in a way that does not announce itself dramatically. It just quietly hardens into a permanent resentment of their own timeline. And that bitterness is the one thing that can destroy a late emergence. Not the delay itself, not the failure, not the wandering. The story the man decides to tell about what those years were for. There are men who make it all the way to the end of their lives, still measuring themselves against a timeline that was never built for them, still carrying the weight of a race they were never designed to run. And there are men who reach that same age and say quietly, without ceremony, that they finally feel like themselves. The difference between those two men is not talent. It is not luck. It is one decision made, usually more than once, across many years. The decision to read the past as material rather than as verdict. Here is what that actually looks like in practice. The man who failed at 3 businesses does not call those 3 failures. He calls them the 3 most expensive educations he ever received. And he means it. Not as a reframe to feel better, but because he genuinely understands what each one taught him that he could not have learned another way. The man who spent years in work that felt wrong does not look back at that time as wasted. He recognizes it as the process of elimination that cleared the ground for the thing that was actually his. This is not positive thinking, it is accurate thinking. Because from the outside, there is truly no visible difference between a man who wasted a decade and a man who spent a decade building something no one could see yet. The only difference is what the man himself knows about what happened during those years. And that private knowledge is what changes everything about how he moves from that point forward. There is one last thing I want to say. The men who arrive late, who finally steps into something that is genuinely theirs after years of building in the dark, they carry a specific quality that early achievers almost never have. Settledness. Not the brittle confidence of someone who has always won. Something heavier than that. A consistency that does not shift depending on who is watching or how much pressure is in the room. A man who knows who he is because he had to figure it out the hard way across real time without shortcuts. That quality cannot be performed. It cannot be faked. It does not come from reading the right books or finding the right mentor. It comes from being the man who kept going when there was no visible reason to, and building something real out of that. So, if you are in the middle of the delay right now, if you are watching other men arrive at places you have not reached yet, carrying things you cannot yet explain to anyone, here is the only thing worth saying. The years that look like nothing are not nothing. They are just not finished yet. If any part of this video felt like something you have been living without having the words for, leave it in the comments. I read all of them. And if you want more content like this, subscribe. Genuinely helps me keep making it. See you in the next one.